Okay, class, in this video, I'm going to show you how to create some do some group nesting and create some user accounts first. First, I'm going to create 2 user accounts in each domain. In the parent domain, I'm going to create them old school using Active Directory users and computers. So I'm going into Active Directory users and computers, highlighting users, right-clicking, and say New User. I'm going to create one called User 1. User account will be U1. I'm not going to require the user account, the user to change the password first time they log in. Just using our standard password. And I'm going to create another user that way. The second one is called user 2, U2. Not requiring them to change the password the first time they log in. In real life, I wouldn't do this. I would never ask the user account for their password. I would give them a temporary password and let them set it however they want. If the user ever has something bad happen to their account, they could blame you if you know their password. So never, for your own protection, know a user's password. Now I'm going to go to the child domain and create 2 users there. But instead of using that utility, I'm going to use this utility. We haven't played with this yet. Active Directory Administrative Center. Okay, now I'm going to close this out. So here's our child domain. Now when we delete a user object, it's deleted. There's no way to bring it back unless you restore from a backup. Let's say I have 2 DCs, and I delete a user account from DC1. It doesn't actually delete it. It does something called tombstone. It labels that user object as being deleted. And then it's going to replicate the change to DC2. And it's going to label it as tombstone. And after a certain amount of time, it'll actually delete the object. I can't remember the time frame for a tombstone object. And the reason for that is, let's say we delete the user account here, and it replicates the change as being deleted. And let's say in the meantime, we've come back and want to, let's say we delete the object here. And in the meantime, DC2 replicated over to DC1, it would replace that object. So that's why it doesn't delete it, it tombstones it. So when someone tries to send over an update to that object, it will reject that update. Another problem we have when you delete an object is when you delete it here, it gets replicated and deleted here. If you go back and restore that object from your backup, at that point, DC2 will replicate over to DC1 and say, wait a second, that object's been deleted, and it will delete it again. So when you restore from a backup, you have to do something called an authoritative restore. You go to the computer where you're going to restore the object, the DC. Restore from the backup, then disconnect the network so that DC can't receive any sort of replication traffic from any other DC. Then you're going to boot and press F8 and run in the startup menu. You're going to do something called an Active Directory authoritative restore mode. So you're going to boot up into Active Directory, and then you're going to run some NTUtil utility and label that object that you restored, a user account, an OU, a group account, whatever it was, as authoritative. And then you reboot the DC and connect it back to the network. So when this DC2 tries to replicate over to DC1 saying an object's been deleted, DC1 will ignore it and say, wait, even though I have an older version of the database because you just restored it from the backup, mine is the authoritative answer, and then replicate the change back to DC2 saying and restoring the object. Basically, it's a big pain in the butt. So what we can do is, with this new administrative center, we have something called, and this was introduced, I believe, in 2012, a recycle bin. Once you've enabled it, you can't disable it at a later time. So whenever you delete an object in Active Directory, it just goes into the recycle bin. At that point, if you wanted to, you can manually go into the recycle bin and delete that object, or you can restore it. So it makes it a lot easier to restore user accounts or anything that you've deleted in Active Directory. It doesn't have anything to do with files. This is just like an Active Directory recycle bin. As soon as this is done, I'm going to show you how to use this utility to create user accounts. Actually, while we're waiting, I'm going to do it over in, oh wait. I'm not sure why I'm getting this error. I probably just need to do a reboot. So I'm just going to leave that alone for now. But that's a nice thing in this Active Directory Administrative Center is you have that recycle bin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create 2 new users using this utility. Now, over in DC1, I was able to create the user accounts, but if I wanted to add them to a group, I have to right-click, go Properties, then go to Member Of, and add them to the group. If I wanted to change anything with their account, I have to do it here. If I wanted to add telephone numbers, addresses and stuff, you have to create the account first, then edit it. With this new utility, you can do it all at one time. So I'm going to highlight users and say new user. So now when you create a user account, you can do all of this stuff here when you create it. If there's certain utilities here that you don't use, like let's say you don't want to use a password silo. Which is right here. Let's say you don't use authentication silo or authentication policy or a directly associated password setting. You can unselect those items so they're not seen. So when you come into this utility, you only see the things that you normally set. Wait a second until my screen refreshes. Let me go over here, then back. Okay, so you can hide any section of this utility you don't normally want to see. So I'm going to put in the name. User 3. The user account name will be U3. I can set my password. If I check this and don't check anything here, it won't prompt them to change their password next time they log in. I could put in their contact information, where they're located. I can add them to groups. I can mess with the roaming profile, all when I create the account. When I click OK, it'll create the account. A nice thing that it does here is it also, if I click on this little up arrow, it shows you all of the PowerShell commands that it used to create that user account. So I'm going to copy it all. And I can paste it in a script and customize it to whatever I need. So in the future, I can just, edit this script and set it so I put in variables instead of hard coding the names, and create your own little PowerShell script to create users. This is a little bit overkill for creating a user account, but it's a very thorough script. So I'm going to close this out. I just wanted to show you the PowerShell stuff as part of this script. So now I'm going to create another user account. Called user for U4. Set my password. And make sure the password doesn't expire. Click OK. And I'm going to create 2 user accounts on DC3. Again, I'm going to use the Administrative Center. Actually, I'm going to go press recycle bin, turn that on again. So while it's working, I'm going to go over to DC6. I don't know why I'm connected to the wrong domain. For some reason, it automatically, because I'm signed in as Contoso. That's why. So it automatically connected me to the Contoso domain because I'm signed in as the Contoso administrator. What I want to do is, I'm trying to create user accounts for a datum. So I'm going to highlight users, new user, user 5, U5 is the user account name, and I'm going to change the password so it doesn't have to be reset. Then I'm going to create one more user account, user 6, u6. I'm also going to check this, and I'll explain this in a minute. Other user, I'm going to set it to other password options so I don't have to reset their password when I log in as that account. By default, in the old method of creating user accounts, this is turned on. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go back to the old school method. So if I try to delete this user account, it's saying I don't have privileges because I have it protected from accidental deletion. Because you can very easily accidentally delete an object, not these because these are built in, but I could create an object like an OU, put a bunch of users in it, then accidentally delete it, and also delete all the user accounts. And if that OU had a bunch of user accounts, then at that point, you would have deleted all those user accounts. So if you turn that on, and you want to delete a user account legitimately, what you have to do is, if you right-click the user account, go to Properties, you don't have all the tabs. You're missing some tabs. So I'm going to go to View, Advanced Features, now when you look at the user account, you have more tabs. I'm trying to find the tab that I want. This Object tab. We won't see this Object tab until you go to Advanced Features. And at that point, you can uncheck this box and then delete the user account. So it's kind of a fail-safe so you don't accidentally delete something that you really find important. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we created 2 user accounts in the datum. We created 2 user accounts in child. We created 2 user accounts in the parent. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set up group nesting so they can all access this DFS resource. So I want to talk about the 3 different types of groups. We have universal groups. Again, native mode means I have 2000 later domain controllers. And for the purpose of this conversation, mixed mode and native mode is essentially the same. This just has some old NT40 domain controllers. So if you go to mixed mode, you can't have universal groups. That's the only difference. It's rare you're going to find a mixed mode domain anymore. But in native mode, we have 3 types of groups: a universal group, a global group, and a domain local group. The things that you can make a member of for a global group is other global groups. The things you can make to be a member of a universal group is other universal groups, global groups, and account from any domain in the forest. So I can nest global groups from the child domain in a universal group in the parent domain. So it could be global groups, universal groups, or accounts from anywhere in the forest. It's kind of like a catch-all. You want to try to avoid using universal groups. Unlike the other two groups, the group membership for universal groups are stored in the global catalog. So if you use universal groups, then you're going to have a performance drop due to the fact that you're going to be nailing your global catalogs. Every time you make a change to that global group, it's going to spawn replication between those global groups. Every time you make a change to your universal groups, it's going to spawn replication between your global catalogs. So try to avoid using universal groups. Back in the day when I used to do freelance work, I would go to companies and I would fix their domain issues. I wasn't like a tech support. I only came in when there was something really wrong with their domain. If I went into an organization and I see they used a lot of universal groups, at that point I knew I was going to be earning my money. Try to avoid universal groups. They work really easy, but again, the performance drop you're going to get because of your global catalogs, it's not worth it. There's better ways to do it without messing up with your global catalog. The next group is global groups. Global groups you can make members, global groups, and accounts from the same domain, and that's it. If you only have one domain, you stick with global groups. So if I had a global group in parent domain, I can take global groups from this parent domain and accounts from this domain and nest them and make them members of that global group. Domain local groups. A domain local group can take universal groups, global groups, and accounts from any domain in the forest. It can also take domain local groups from the same domain. A domain local group is the only type of group you can nest other domain local groups from in the same domain. You cannot take domain local groups from other domains and nest them in a domain local group. This article really doesn't cover how to really set things up. So that's what this lab is going to be about. What you want to do is you want to take a resource and assign permissions to a domain local group. So that's what we're going to do first. So in the domain where your resource is, so in a case like this, I have a DFS share in my parent domain, so I'm going to create a domain local group. And again, this is only in a multi-domain environment. If I had only one domain, I would stick with global groups. So I'm going to create a new group. And I have two types of group types. Security groups, which we'll use for permission, and distribution groups, which we'll use for email. So I'm going to create a resource access group. It's going to be a domain local. Click OK. So now I'm going to go over to my server manager, I'm going to go over to DFS 1, go to the server manager and change permissions for that DFS, which we haven't done yet. So from your server manager, go to File and Storage Services, go to Shares, and for the net share, I'm going to right click, go to Properties, and under Permission, I'm going to customize the permissions. Our share permission, we already fixed when we created this share. We said everyone allow, so that turns off share permissions. They're not in play at this point. So I'm going to go to Permissions and delete the two user groups. That includes domain users and local users, which I might not have control over. So I just want to create a domain group that I have control over. So I'm going to add resource access So I'm going to wait a little bit. I need replication to kick in. So I'm going to pause the video and let it set for a minute. Guys, it wasn't a replication issue. I had a typo. So to avoid that typo, I'm just going to go back and fix it. I'm going to go to my parent DC. I'm just going to delete this and recreate it since it's brand new. I'm going to create a new group. It's going to be a domain local group. And I had a typo. So I'm going to click OK. Go back to the DFS server. Select a principal. Resource access. Then I'm going to give them modify rights. So when we design group nesting, for any resource that you have, you're going to grant permission to a domain local group. And the admin for that domain will have control over that domain local group. I'm going to click OK. So resource access has modified rights to that resource. I'll click OK, then OK. So now what I'm going to do is go to each of my domains again. So I'm going to create in each domain a new group. So I'm going to call this one in the parent domain, parent resource users. And it's going to be a global group. I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to add my two user accounts. To parent resource users. Click OK. So if I look at this group again and go under members, I can see my two user accounts from this domain are added to that global group. And that's allowed. Global groups can have user accounts from the same domain. So I'm going to do the same thing for the child domain. This just needs to be rebooted. I'm not going to worry about it now. So under Active Directory users and computers, guys, I prefer this method because I'm old school. I've been using it for years to create users and groups, as opposed to the Active Directory Administrative Center. So I'm going to create a new group in the child domain. called child resource users. Again, it's going to be a global group. I'm going to add my 2 user accounts to that global group. Now if I look at that group, and under the member tab, I can see for the child resource users, I have them added to that group. I'm going to do the same thing for our data. I have my 2 user accounts created already, so I'm going to create a new group. It could be any name you want. I'm just trying to get very self-explanatory names. Create another global group in the tree domain. I'm going to add those 2 users. If I wanted to, I could do it this way. I could go to Member tab, add U5. Click OK. I could do it this way. Instead of going to the group, I could go to the user account and say Member of tab. Yeah, I need to reboot these machines. So by default, every user account is part of the domain user group. So when you create a new user, they're automatically added to that group. I also want to add them to tree. All I really need to do is type tree R. That's the only group that starts with that. Click OK. So 3 ways to add a user to a group. Go to the user account, then go to the Member of tab, go to the group account, go to the Members tab, or just highlight a series of user accounts and right-click, then add to group. Same method. So guys, before I do anything else, I'm going to pause the video and reboot all my DCs. And I'm going to do that with the script I created last time. Yeah, when these machines go into hibernation, it really causes havoc with Active Directory. In real production network, your servers never go to sleep. So I'm going to pause the video after I run this script. So here's my script. I'm just going to press play. It'll synchronize the time and reboot the DCs. See, it's rebooting DC1 now. Again, I'm running this on DC4 because it's the last item in my script. I want this machine to be the last machine to reboot. So I'm going to pause the video. It's going to take like 10 minutes, maybe a little longer to reboot them. Okay, what I did was I made all of my DCs global catalogs. It hasn't replicated yet, but what you can do is go to each of your DC, expand it, highlight NTDS settings, go to properties, and check the box. And it's going to take a while to replicate. I think on ACE-IT, we might just keep them all global catalogs because it's just too much of a pain having to reboot all these times. So I have all my machines, all my DCs as global catalog servers. So now back to where we were. We created this resource access group, granted modifier rights to our DFS share. Then we created a global group in each domain. In this one, I created a parent resource users group. It's a global group. And this originally was a domain local. The resource access is a domain local. So I grant permission to a resource to a domain local group. I create global groups in each of my domains, and I add my users to the global group. My domain admin for the parent domain controls this group. I'm on the child DC. My domain admin for the child domain controls this group, meaning every time the administrator needs to add someone to the group, he doesn't have to call the enterprise admin. He can just do it himself. And the domain admin for datum.com controls this group. It's a global group, and my users for the tree domain are members of that group. So you create global groups in each of your domains. Put your user accounts in those global groups. Then on the domain where there is a resource, you create a domain local group, and you assign permissions to the domain local group. And then what you do is, I go into my domain local group. I'm going to go to the members tab. I'm going to add parent resource. I'm just going to type that, click OK. I'm going to add all my global groups from all three domains here. So there's my global group from my parent domain. I'm going to change location and choose the child domain, and then my global group from there, child R. Do it again, change the location to my tree domain, datum, and do tree R. So all my user accounts are in these three groups. Datum users are here, child users are here, parent users are here. I've added them to this group. Then I've assigned permissions to that resource. So I got to pause and let it replicate that information. Okay, guys, I'm still waiting for it to get replicated, so I'm going to try a different method so I don't have to wait. In real life, you have to wait. So I'm going to go to the tree domain. And I'm going to sign in as actually, I'm going to do something cool, something you haven't seen before. I'm going to click on the Start menu and type mmc.exe. I'm going to right-click it. It's not allowing me to do it. I wanted to run it as a different user account, but it's not allowing me. I'm going to sign out of here and sign in as a domain admin for the parent domain. Even though I'm on the tree domain, the group that I want to modify is in the parent domain, the resource access group. So I'm going to sign in as a Contoso administrator. The reason why I'm doing it here is because I don't have to wait for replication. The tree domain knows about that global group that's inside the tree domain. I'm going to open up Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to right-click this group and add to another group. That's not working either. I'm going to go into Properties. I'm going to make this a member of. I'm going to change the location to be contoso.com. Then I'm going to type resource access. Okay. I'm going to go back to the parent domain now. So ultimately what you want is, and you might have to wait to get this to work, the members should be all three global groups. So you add your global groups, you add your global groups to each domain, you put your users in it. Then in the domain where the resource is, like our DFS share, you would assign permissions to that. So now, if the Adatum administrator wants to grant rights to the DFS share, he doesn't need to call the parent domain admin. All he needs to do is just add his user to this group. If the child domain admin wants to grant rights to this DFS server, all he has to do is add the user to this group. These groups are added to the resource access, and the resource access is granted permissions to that share. So I'm going to go over to this machine right here. Sorry, DFS2. Actually, I'll do it on DFS1. I'm going to sign in as each of those users and see if I can create something in that DFS share. See if I have truly have modify rights. So I'm going to go to other user. I'm going to sign in as Adatum U6. again, each domain has its own global group. You put the users in the global groups. On the domain where the resource is, you create a domain local group, then nest your global groups from all your domains into the domain local group. And then you assign permissions to the domain local group. So I'm going to go to my DFS share. And create a new document. So I was able to create a new document. I'm going to sign in as U4. That is a user account from the child domain. I want to make sure user accounts in the child domain can access the DFS server from the parent domain. I'm going to connect to the DFS. And see if I can create a document as a child user, which I can. The reason why I'm choosing a DFS server, because normal user accounts cannot sign into DCs. So I had to pick a machine that wasn't a domain controller. So I'm going to sign in as Contoso. U2, this is a user account from the parent domain. And I want to verify that I have rights to the DFS share. So I have 3 users in 3 different domains now able to access a resource that's in the parent domain, which is the DFS1. Just going to reiterate one more time. Create your user accounts in each of the domains. Create global groups in each of the domains and put your user accounts in their respective global groups. That global group is controlled by that domain admin. So whenever they want to add a new user, they can just add them to the group by themselves. Then in the resource in the domain where the resource is, in this case the parent domain, you create a domain local group, nest all the global groups from all the domains into that domain local group, and then you assign permission to that domain local group for that resource. In our case, we assign modify rights. Now, if you just try to add the user accounts directly to the resource, it would work, but you would work the domain admin for the parent domain to death, because every time you needed to grant someone rights to that share or remove someone's rights to the share, you would have to get involved every single time. This way, each domain admin controls their own global group, so they can determine who has access to that share. The only time the parent domain admin has to get involved is when he's adding users to his own global group. Okay, that's it, guys, for this video. I know it's a confusing topic. Global groups go in domain local groups. Domain local groups are granted rights to a resource, a shared printer, a network share, any resource that you can share on the network. The next thing we're going to do is I want to go over group policies and show you how to create a group policy that you can use on all of your domains without having to recreate the group policy on every single domain. So that's it for this video.